from a hunter whose tracks in the snow suddenly stopped, to logging roads where a truck is found and no sign of where the hunter went. Today, I'm hunting down hunters who disappeared without a trace. I've always enjoyed hunting, until I realized I could just as easily be the one who disappears. On November 13, 2014, the Wind River Range in Wyoming was already in early winter conditions. Above 10,000 feet, wide alpine basins and open saddles stretched across the landscape, with snow covering the ground, but visibility still largely open and exposed. Darren Koch, 41, had been hunting this region for years. He was experienced in the backcountry and familiar with the drainage systems. On this trip, he was with a small group of hunters he had gone out with before. They were used to working together, and the plan was simple: move through the basin, cover different areas, and regroup later at a set point before heading back. They started early in the morning, moving into the open basin while conditions were still stable. The group spread out as they followed the terrain, staying within sight when possible but adjusting to the shape of the ground and changing visibility. Darren moved with them at first, visible across open stretches of snow between rock and shallow rises, before gradually drifting slightly off the main line toward an open saddle connecting two sections of the drainage. It was a familiar kind of stopping point in that terrain, where hunters often pause to rest, adjust layers, or confirm direction before continuing across open ground. Darren slowed near the saddle, briefly checking his compass and shifting his pack weight, before telling the group he would pause there for a moment to reorient and catch his breath before moving on. The group continued forward, expecting him to follow shortly after or rejoin them further along the route. There was no urgency at the time, but as they moved deeper into the basin, spacing naturally widened and brief gaps between visual contact became more frequent as the terrain dipped and rose in uneven sections. In conditions like this, small separations weren't unusual, but they also weren't always as temporary as they seemed in the moment. No one treated it as an immediate concern. By the time they realized he hadn't reappeared, the group was already spread farther apart than they had been earlier in the route. No response came. By now, the assumption that he would simply rejoin the group on the route no longer held for me. They eventually turned back toward the saddle where they had last seen him. His tracks were still visible in the snow, leading into the open ground between the drainage lines. They followed them step by step across the saddle, expecting to find where he had continued or peeled off. But the tracks did not continue in any visible way beyond the center of the saddle. There was no branching trail, no return path, no change in direction. The impressions simply stopped in the open snow. They searched the immediate area first, moving in widening circles across the saddle and calling his name repeatedly. The terrain offered no cover beyond scattered rock and snow, and there were no signs of movement or disturbance in any direction. Let me be clear with you. Once a search expands like this, it usually means the first assumptions about direction have already failed. As time passed, they expanded outward into the surrounding basin, checking lower slopes, drainage edges, and nearby openings where someone might naturally continue or descend. When no response came, search efforts were reported, and teams were brought in. The saddle became the focus, with crews retracing the exact area where his tracks ended. Dogs were deployed, but could not establish a trail beyond that final line, with scent work repeatedly breaking down near exposed rock, wind-scoured snow, and open wind corridors across the saddle. Ground teams expanded outward into adjacent drainages and higher benches of the basin, systematically rechecking likely travel paths. Helicopters conducted repeated aerial sweeps over surrounding ridgelines and open bowls as conditions allowed, but no consistent movement pattern or physical trace was ever identified beyond the saddle itself. The only confirmed trace of him remains the group's account of his last stop at the saddle and the tracks that led into it and ended there, unchanged, undisturbed, and continuing straight into open snow before simply stopping without any visible continuation. It becomes clear how a simple separation in open terrain can turn irreversible without anyone immediately noticing. In the next case, the environment shifts completely, but the absence of a return remains just as unclear. It was September 6, 2016, in a high-elevation mountain drainage in Colorado during early elk rut season, when bulls move through dense timber and open meadow edges under cold nights and warming mornings. The area was a mix of thick spruce stands and small clearings, where sound carries unevenly and visibility changes within short distances. Tomas Weyrich, 34, worked as an irrigation installer out of Montrose and was familiar with demanding outdoor environments. He had hunted elk for over a decade and was experienced with calling setups and moving through timber in close terrain. On this trip, he was with a small group of hunters he had gone out with before. They were spread through different sections of the drainage, each covering assigned ground, with a plan to regroup later in the day. Tomas moved along the edge of a meadow bordered by dense timber on both sides of a narrow opening, choosing a calling position where elk were most likely to step out from cover into open ground. He stayed just inside the tree line, beginning his calls into the timber while making small adjustments along the edge to stay aligned with any response or movement. Honestly, this is where things always feel normal right before they aren't. I keep noticing that pattern in cases like this. The group could still hear him working the same general line. Nothing about it suggested urgency or disruption. In this kind of terrain, brief pauses and repositioning are normal, especially when a hunter is tracking elk through thick cover and adjusting for visibility and wind. Then the pattern stopped. The calling cut off completely, not fading with distance, not drifting deeper into the forest, just ending. The timberline went quiet, and no further sound came from his position. At first, the others assumed he had moved deeper into cover or shifted location to stay with the elk. That kind of adjustment was common in these conditions, especially when animals were moving through dense timber. They waited longer than usual. No response came back. One of the group moved toward his last known position along the meadow edge, with the others following while scanning the timberline. There was still no sound or movement coming from inside the trees. When they reached the spot where he had last been active, his position was still clear from earlier. The meadow edge was intact, and elk sign continued into the timber. But Tomas was gone. There was no return line and no visible path back out. They called out, no response came back. You can almost feel the distance getting heavier here. The group searched outward from that point along the timber edge and into the forest, where elk tracks continued deeper in. The ground was uneven, cluttered with brush, fallen timber, and overlapping trails. As they expanded, every direction led to the same result. No confirmed continuation from the last known point. They pushed into adjacent timber and drainage lines, but tracking quickly broke down under dense cover and crossing paths. It was no longer treated as a brief separation. The last confirmed point remained the only reference, and nothing beyond it could be established. Search teams were brought in, and ground crews retraced the meadow edge and timber line where he had last been seen. Dogs were deployed, but did not establish a consistent trail beyond that final position. Ground teams expanded into adjacent drainages, while aerial searches covered open slopes and ridgelines above the basin. Despite full coverage, no confirmed trace of movement was ever recovered beyond the last known point. Over the following days, repeated searches through the drainage produced no new findings. Seasonal conditions and terrain complexity gradually erased what little could be followed on the ground. Tomas Weyrich was never found. It's difficult not to notice how quickly normal movement inside familiar hunting patterns can turn into something unreadable. The next case moves away from timber terrain and into a completely different kind of landscape, but the outcome follows the same silence. It was October 9th, 2015. And the Rock Creek trailhead outside Red Lodge sat under clear, early morning skies, with pale light over the Beartooth Plateau and calm air at 28 degrees. Above treeline, the terrain was open and exposed, with long sightlines across rolling alpine ground and distant ridgelines. Clem Harstad, 58, was a retired county road surveyor who still went into the backcountry alone on familiar routes. He was methodical in every aspect of travel, keeping written trip logs, planned bearings, and strict return times. That morning, he informed his colleagues he would be heading onto the Beartooth Plateau to check a series of familiar elevation markers and scout sections of his usual hunting routes ahead of the winter season, expecting to return by evening. After he left the trailhead, they had a general understanding of the direction he planned to take and the time frame he was working within. The early part of the day passed normally, with no indication that anything had gone off schedule. His colleagues stayed behind with a general understanding of his route and timing. As the day progressed, they began checking in as conditions across the Beartooth Plateau started to shift. At first, the lack of response was still easy to attribute to distance or weak signal in open terrain. By mid to late afternoon, repeated attempts through phone and radio produced nothing, and what began as a routine check-in window slowly turned into a sustained lack of contact. As the weather system continued to build, they kept monitoring both the conditions and his status, watching the timeline they had agreed on slowly pass without any contact. By this point, time was the only reference they had left to work with. The Beartooth Plateau above 10,000 feet is one of the largest above-tree-line landscapes in the lower 48 states. By midday, cloud cover began building over the region, gradually tightening visibility across ridgelines and open basins. Clem had already moved out across the open plateau when conditions began to shift more noticeably, with cloud cover building faster than forecast and visibility between ridgelines starting to compress. By late morning, wind had increased across the open ground, pushing thin sheets of snow across exposed sections, and landmarks that were clear earlier in the day began to lose definition at distance. They continued attempting to reach him throughout the day, but there was no response. What began as a routine check-in gradually shifted into concern as the hours passed, and his expected timing came and went without any contact. By the afternoon, it was no longer just delayed communication. It was a complete loss of contact, with no confirmation of his position as weather conditions across the plateau continued to deteriorate. By evening, his return window had passed without any contact or confirmation of his position. Further attempts to reach him that night were also unsuccessful. Search efforts were initiated after he failed to return. Ground teams were deployed into the plateau once conditions allowed access, following his planned route and last known direction of travel. Teams covered sections of the Beartooth Plateau and surrounding drainages, retracing likely paths from treeline outward. Despite extensive searches over multiple days, no confirmed sign of Clem was ever found. The last verified reference point remained his crossing of the exposed plateau ridge, after which he moved out of clear visual range into shifting cloud cover, and no further trace, footprint line, or directional sign was ever recovered beyond that crossing. Over the following days, additional searches were conducted as conditions improved. Aerial sweeps and ground grid patterns were used across multiple sections of the plateau, but no trace consistent with his movement was recovered. Seasonal changes followed, and snow cover gradually erased surface indicators across the region. Later inspections during melt periods also produced no findings tied to his route or position. The mapped loop he had planned to follow showed no deviation, and no physical sign, tracks, markers, or disturbance in the snowpack was ever recovered along the final crossing section of the plateau. Clem Harstad was never found. The case remains unresolved in record and in fact. What lingers here is how even the most structured planning starts to fail once weather removes every visual reference point. The next case shifts again, this time into logging systems where repetition itself becomes part of the uncertainty. It was November 14th, 2013, and a rural logging access point in northern Wisconsin sat under cold, overcast conditions, with empty gravel roads leading into dense second-growth forest. Once inside the timber, visibility dropped quickly, and navigation depended entirely on memory of the logging road network rather than direct sight. Aldous Fenner, 47, was a fence contractor and experienced hunter who had worked this forest system for nearly 2 decades. Known for consistency over risk, he stuck to familiar routes, logged every trip, and rarely changed plans without reason. Locally, he was regarded as one of the most reliable outdoorsmen in the region, often referenced in discussions about difficult hunts and terrain. I think this kind of reputation always changes how people read what comes next in a case like this. He left alone early in the morning, taking a familiar logging route into timber he had hunted before, checking a set of boundary cuts along the North Fork sector after recent winter track reports. A trail camera captured his truck entering the system at a junction off the main road. After that point, no further confirmation of direction of travel was ever established. Beyond the junction, the logging network split into near-identical spurs, stretching deep into second-growth forest, where each route blended into the next, with no distinguishing markers to confirm which path had been taken. Inside that system, roads begin to look the same even when they diverge, and distance loses clear reference points. Aldous continued from the junction onto a secondary spur branching off the main logging network, following a route he had used before under similar conditions, last seen tracking deeper into the North Fork sector before the road split out of clear sight among near-identical service spurs. And that right there is where familiar terrain can quietly become misleading, even for experienced hunters who trust repetition over anything else. At first, there was no concern. He was expected to move at his usual pace, but as the morning went on and his check-in window passed, messages were sent to his number. No response came back. By midday, low cloud cover and reduced visibility settled over the region, and his expected check-in window passed without confirmation. Initial attempts to reach him were still treated as routine delays common in the logging network. By afternoon, the lack of response no longer matched his usual patterns. Calls and radio attempts failed to connect, and attention shifted from delay to full absence as the timeline continued to slip past without any verified contact. By evening, his return window had closed with no communication or sign of exit from the system. Search efforts were initiated after he failed to return. Teams moved into the logging system once conditions allowed, following known routes and branching spurs connected to his last confirmed direction. Ground crews worked through dense timber and intersecting road networks, retracing likely paths from the junction outward. Despite coverage of the area, no confirmed trace of Aldous was found. Over the following days, expanded searches continued across adjacent logging sections and secondary corridors. Dogs were deployed, but scent work broke down at intersections where multiple routes overlapped. Ground and aerial sweeps covered accessible terrain, yet nothing consistent with his movement was recovered. Aldous Fenner was never found. The case remains unresolved in record and in fact. All that remains is the logging junction, where he was last recorded entering the system, a branching network of forest roads that produced no confirmed route of travel and no recovered trace of movement, vehicle exit, or directional sign anywhere beyond that point. This case leaves behind a different kind of uncertainty, where familiar routes and heavy use of the system don't prevent a complete loss of trace. The final case moves into wetland terrain, where stability itself becomes the central problem. It was October 21st, 2017, at a forest access point in northern Minnesota under cold, still conditions, where upland ground dropped into flooded bog terrain that appeared stable but was not. Gord Pallister, 52, was a warehouse shift supervisor from International Falls who had hunted the region for more than 2 decades. He was a stand hunter by habit, usually staying fixed near known travel corridors rather than moving through unfamiliar wetland ground. He preferred routine, familiar routes, and he had always hunted with a partner until this trip. In his daily life, he was consistent about communication. From what I found, that kind of routine usually becomes almost automatic for people like him in the field. If he reached his position, he would usually check in with his wife before settling into the hunt. It wasn't something he forgot to do. It was part of how he always operated. That morning, he left before first light carrying his rifle, stand, and gear weighing over 60 pounds. He moved along the edge of flooded ground, following the boundary between upland terrain and the wetland system, where he planned to set up near a known deer crossing point that typically held movement through the bog edge. The area ahead was quiet, flat in appearance, and broken only by shallow variations in vegetation and waterlogged ground. Nothing about the conditions suggested urgency or difficulty at that stage. From there, he continued in the same general direction he had chosen earlier. From a distance, there was nothing unusual about his movement. The landscape remained still, with no visible disturbance across the bog or surrounding edge. He was expected to settle into position, establish himself, and check in once he was set, following the same routine he had used on prior hunts in similar conditions. That check-in never came. At first, it was treated as a routine delay, but as the morning progressed and repeated attempts to reach him failed, the absence of contact no longer matched his usual pattern. By midday, all communication attempts had failed, and by evening, there was still no return to the access point. At that point, it was no longer just a delay in timing. The expected structure of his day had completely fallen out of place, with his normal return window passing without any sign of him. Search efforts were initiated after he failed to return. Teams moved into the wetland system once conditions allowed access, working outward from the entry point along the upland edge where he was last confirmed to be traveling before entering the bog corridor. His final identifiable position was along the transition line, where firm upland ground began to break into saturated peat and shallow standing water. From that point, his direction of travel was still readable, moving off the solid edge and into low brush, leading toward the bog interior. That was the last place where movement could be logically traced on stable ground. Beyond that transition, the terrain changed abruptly, with soft, waterlogged ground that failed to hold clear footprints and vegetation too broken to preserve a continuous path, leaving no continuation of tracks, disturbance, or directional movement beyond the boundary line. The terrain itself complicated the search. Sections of bog ground offered little stability, and visibility across open wetland areas made it difficult to distinguish movement paths from natural surface variation. Even repeated passes over likely areas produced no consistent indicators. His truck remained at the access point where he had parked it, untouched. Inside, the interior showed no signs of disturbance. His phone was still powered on, left on the seat, last activity showing an unanswered incoming call after he had already moved into the wetland system. That part always hits me differently, because it means everything was still technically on, just without anyone there to respond. During the drive back, it rang with the weekly call he never missed. No one answered.